really glad Free State Project is making its home here. Really happy with all the work that they've done. So thank you, Free State Project. 5 years ago, I joined the New Hampshire Army National Guard. I did so out of duty to my state, my home, my community. I joined and I knew I wanted to do something for my home. If there was ever a snowstorm or a flood, I wanted to be that first call. Over the last year, I served my state as part of the New Hampshire National Guard COVID Joint Task Force. I did exactly what I signed up to do, helping my fellow citizens get through what we all went through over the last year and a half. Unfortunately, the National Guard is continually deployed overseas in 20-year conflicts. There are now 3 generations of warfighters overseas. And when disaster strikes at home, sometimes these National Guard soldiers are not here. They're in the Middle East. During Katrina, the Louisiana National Guard was deployed overseas. Those guardsmen, some of whom were vital civil engineers that could have helped with the rebuilding process. During the wildfires out west, the California National Guard was deployed to the Middle East. They had many life-saving helicopters that could have assisted in the firefighting efforts. Even in New Hampshire, when disaster strikes in our own communities, sometimes the New Hampshire Guard is not here. We're elsewhere. The New Hampshire Guard and Guard throughout the country are called citizen soldiers. We have jobs, families, lives at home. We have obligations to our communities and our own civilian careers. From 9/11 until today, almost 2/3 of all military deployed have been National Guard soldiers. These frequent deployments have taken a toll on these part-time soldiers, costing them jobs, marriages, and time that they could spend with their loved ones. And the New Hampshire National Guard takes its lineage from the Minutemen, always ready at a moment's notice. And it's very easy to rely on the National Guard to get things done. It's very easy for politicians to call on the National Guard to defend us. But who is going to defend the National Guard? Joining me today, I'm proud to introduce Diego Rivera, who is the Deputy Director with Bring Our Troops Home, and Idaho State Representative Ben Adams. And I also have Brakey, Senator from Maine.
Yeah, we're Senator Senior Spokesperson of the Young Americans. Thank you. How we doing?
Excellent.
Woo! Wake up, people, wake up. Everybody's having fun last night. How we doing? Woo! My name is Diego, like you said, we're about to do this again. I'm going to bring our troops home.
I'm Representative Ben Adams from the great state of Idaho. My connection to this is that I've been connected to Bring Our Troops Home for quite a while. I also carried Defender Guard in Idaho in this last session. I'm a Marine Corps veteran, 2 tours to Afghanistan. I've got skin in the game, and I'm well invested in this endeavor.
And I'm Eric Brakey. I'm the senior spokesperson of Young Americans for Liberty, where we've been helping the fight on this legislation across the country, providing some ground support for our great legislators and Bring Our Troops Home. Before serving at Young Americans for Liberty, I was a 2-term state senator from in the state of Maine, and also before that, I was the state director for the Ron Paul 2012 presidential campaign. And that was the year I attended my first Pork Fest, so glad to be back.
Alright, so I'm going to break it down just this way. You know, I figure we'll talk a little bit about Bring Our Troops Home, what it is, just in case you guys haven't heard it. Just by a round of applause. How many people know who Bring Our Troops Home is? The organization, if you don't. I won't go too much into it. I'm sure maybe you guys have heard it. I was definitely looking into it, and it's kind of story. One of the most compelling stories stories ever. If that doesn't get you, I don't know what can. But Bring Our Troops Home is an organization that essentially calls for sober foreign policy, and we push for things like defend the guard, something that Bring Our Troops Home essentially does, one of many things. And that's going to be, I think, a good part of this discussion too, is defend the guard. How many people know what that is? Right. And so we can get to talking about that, but I want people to kind of get their heads wrapped around this, is that Bring Our Troops Home is probably a most to tell them, hey, you know, bring our troops home, stop these endless wars. I don't think anybody, especially in this crowd, is going to be pro-war, but also, I mean, even just from a natural perspective, if you're not super political, you know, 20 years is ridiculous, right? And so now, this is a third generation war. It's not even two, it's three, right? And so we just went there to talk to them about, you know, a sober foreign policy, and the response that we got was nothing, it was crickets. We had a huge event, we made a hell of a show out of it, and then we just marched in there, and they heard us, and they did nothing about it, and so we shifted to, you know, pushing for Defend the Guard, which is pushing locally, which makes more sense, right? And it calls for, you know, radical decentralization, which I think we're all for. And here's the thing, is that Bring Our Troops Home is essentially three people. It's myself, Dan, and Hunter. And, you know, the successes that we've had that we can talk about later has just been because of the help of other people getting involved, like Young Americans for Liberty and the LP, the Mises Caucus, other guys like that, and good legislators that have a lot of fighting in them.
So that DC trip that he was talking about, I had the privilege of going and talking to Senator Tim Kaine from Virginia. Or should I say his military liaison, because he was unavailable to speak to a veteran on this issue. So when I went in and spoke to the liaison, this liaison is a Navy 03. I don't know how, I was enlisted, just so everyone knows. And the officer and enlisted rank system and how the politics of that plays out is very different. There's not a lot of politics in the lower enlisted. And when I went in and I brought my concerns to this liaison, he was a submarine officer too. So a little bit of a different military experience, perhaps. And he said, well, you know, we want to get out of those wars too. We want Congress to reclaim their war powers too. But not until, you know, there's another president. And this is before I was ever in office, when I was first starting to get involved politically at all. And so the approach that he had to it was hyper-partisan, right? Well, we only want to do something good when it looks good for us. Obviously, I have a problem with that. I imagine all of you have a problem with that too. And I would say that's one of the things that sparked me to say, okay, I have to do more, because the people that are in here are making decisions not based on principle, but off of where they can make profit.
You know, I'll say, I think that when we look at the state of the wars, the never-ending wars in the world today, Congress is in a situation where they have no incentive to either end the wars or formally declare them. Because they saw when they voted to, you know, do the AUMFs, like the Iraq War AUMF, which was just repealed, but it's still just a backup AUMF that they still use the Afghanistan 2001 Afghanistan AUMF to justify all the years in places not even in Afghanistan. They saw that, well, geez, when you sign your name to these wars, people lost their re-elections over this. So they're afraid of the public ousting them come re-election season if they sign their names to these very unpopular wars. But they also want the money from the military-industrial complex filling their campaign coffers, so they don't want to vote to end the wars. So they are fine with this inaction, this doing nothing, this maintaining of the status quo. They've surrendered their responsibility to be the watch guards over where and when our nation goes to war, there's no incentive for it. And so this is where I think Defend the Guard as a piece of state legislation is radically brilliant. One, it's on solid constitutional principles. So basically, the state National Guards come from, the history of them comes from the state militias that, fought the Revolutionary War, that freed America from British control. That's the origin of these National Guards. They answer to the states. That's how the whole Constitution of the framework is established. The Constitution says there are 3 circumstances under which authority over the National Guard is transferred to the President. The President can call forth the militia to suppress insurrection, which I think is why they were so focused on calling what happened on January 6th an insurrection, because that's an actual word in the Constitution they can use to justify their actions. But certainly Iraq and Afghanistan, these aren't suppressing insurrections. To repel invasion, well, there's someone who's invaded Iraq, but certainly we're not repelling an invasion. If anything, Washington, D.C. is the invasionary force. And to enforce the laws of the Union. And that one's a little bit more vague. You might wonder, what does it mean to enforce the laws of the Union? Well, if Congress actually declared war, as the Constitution gives them the authority to do, that would become the law of the Union, and the President could call forth the National Guard to enforce that law, to enforce that declaration of war. But because Congress does not issue a declaration of war, there is no law of the Union to enforce. Therefore, the authority rests in the states, and the National Guards are only deployed across the world with the tacit consent of the states. So Defend the Guard is simply saying, we revoke that consent. If you want to take our National Guard troops, which account for, I believe, about half of the active duty combat troops serving overseas, then Congress must declare the war. We force Congress into a situation where they have to act. They have to either vote to authorize, they have to sign their names to it, or they have to let the wars end. And so it's a way to force their hand. And the Pentagon is obviously terrified of this. You've experienced that.
Yeah.
You want to talk about that?
Sure.
You should.
Yeah. So I brought Defend the Guard forward this year in Idaho. I am not a typical, from the concept of a politician where we're all expected to each other's hairs. I'm a Marine. I say it like it is. This is what I'm going to do. Don't get in my way. Is kind of a mentality. And this year the legislature was no different. Brought Defend the Guard forward, told the chairman, I want to hear this. Well, Idaho has a process called print hearings, which is, I believe, we're the only state in the union that does this. So before a bill can actually become a bill and have a bill number where the public can see it, it has a print hearing where it goes before the committee, and you give a short synopsis of what the bill is, and the committee decides whether they will print it and it will be heard, or they will not print it and it won't be heard. Well, I brought my bill forward, I had counted my votes, and I knew that I had enough to get it printed. I had gotten pushback from the Adjutant General of the Idaho National Guard. His claims were that, one, the states did not have the authority to tell the federal government that they could not use the state's troops. Yeah.
They say the supremacy clause, as if the supremacy clause means the federal government can just do whatever it wants. It's not just the Article 1, Section 8 powers, whatever the federal government wants, apparently they can do. There are constitutional limits. Apparently that's their interpretation of the supremacy clause.
Yes, well, that's how they're interpreting it. The second argument was that the funding would dry up for the Idaho National Guard, because why would the federal government fund a National Guard if they can't use them? Well, my response to that was, well, there are two different types of funding. There is Title 32 funding, which is designated as the funding source for all National Guards for the the maintaining of a National Guard force in every state. And then there's Title X deployments. And Title X funding is active duty combat operations overseas. Now, for a National Guard unit to receive Title X deployments, or Title X funding, the governor and the adjutant general has to essentially sign off. So the way it works now is the federal government will lay out, well, we have all these deployments and we are looking for these types of units. And the state never seems to miss a chance to make a dollar, and especially at our expense. And so what they do is they look at it and they say, okay, we are going to take that deployment to Iraq because it pays a bonus to our state. And they argue that, well, we can pay our National Guardsmen. Well, you can pay your National Guardsmen without sending them to Iraq or Afghanistan. It's in Title 32. So in my bill, I differentiated the two. But when I brought the bill forward, I gave my pitch about the states needing to reclaim their sovereignty over the National Guard if we want to stop the increasing size of the federal government, if we want to stop these unconstitutional wars. At some point, the states have to be the ones that rein it in, because we understand, even in a very Republican Idaho, that the federal government does not care what the states want at this point. So, brought it forward, voice vote, clearly more yeses than nos. The chairman, motion fails, gathers it out. The decision had already been made. It wasn't a matter of if I had the votes or not. I learned a lesson, which is always request a roll call vote, where you get everybody on the record of where they're at. Now, having served and being in a committee where there were a lot of members in there that have served as well, there's a certain level of respect we try and keep for each other, even though some of it may not be warranted. And so I said, well, listen, I will hold this over your head all year if I have to. The chairman of that committee was put on blast on local radio. He was put on blast in national news, I believe, for being a phony politician. And I don't disagree.
Yeah, that was actually a lot of fun what they did with, his name's Joe Palmer. You guys should all look him up. He's you don't have to say I can. He's a horrible human being. When he killed that voice vote, what he didn't say afterwards is that, so then they went, okay, so if he killed it, let's call for a recorded vote after the fact so we can all just get it. Maybe you just misheard, right? No, he didn't. So he goes, no, because it failed the voice vote, which is just the ultimate of scummery right there. And the fun that, because it is fun, because, politicians are horrible people for the most part. There's a couple of good ones here, but you and I all agree, right? For the most part, they're all dumb and arrogant, right? And they do horrible things. So it was a lot of fun personally to have this clip. It got brought up on the radio, and not only this, but he got so much support that I heard him on Boise radio, right? And there's veteran after veteran after veteran that's calling and saying, like, I heard what happened, I heard the clip, how dare, Chairman Palmer do this? So, like, not only did he get people from Idaho angry, he got vets angry. And, like, here's one thing, don't piss those guys off, right? So, and it was the most fun I think I've ever had just listening to a radio show. Now, for me, I'm a podcast guy, right? I think most people are. But to be able to listen to the radio show and get a kick out of it, one of the most fun things that I think I've ever heard in my entire life was just veteran after veteran calling, and then they played the clip several times of when it passed. Because not only that, but then, so the problem here with this is that when people weren't talking necessarily, the audio would cut out from the video, so it's hard to hear on the playback that it did it. But my buddy works in production over in New York City, so I sent him the clip. I said, can you just find a way for us to be able to hear it? And once you can hear the yays versus the nays, it was obvious. It was more than obvious. And that was just, it was a scandal. But that's not even That's one of many, but that was a lot of fun that we had there.
I think it's kind of like that moment, if folks remember, like at the 2012 National Republican Convention, you know, well, maybe some young folks here, people don't remember, but like John Boehner, like, you know, when Ron Paul supporters were challenging the rules and challenging the credentials report, and John Boehner's just reading the teleprompter that says the ayes have it, even though the no's are clearly louder and they just steamroll past it. It's kind of like that. But I do want to say that, you know, what happened this year was amazing in that because of, you know, bring our troops home, because of the amazing legislators at Young Americans for Liberty and our army of activists and afterwards for to help get elected, folks like Ben and others. This was filed in 31 states, first time ever. The Pentagon was so scared by this, they had mobilized. It was a 2-star or 3-star general.
Yeah, so it was a 2-star general. They sent over to Aaron Elward, who is just a gangster of a legislator and a good guy, and he really does care about liberty. Filed this bill in South Dakota, and they sent a 2-star adjutant general there to testify against the bill.
So they had to mobilize to try to squash this bill in every state when it became a whack-a-mole, trying to whack it down in every state where it was being filed and coming up. And look, this round, like, they're 31 to 31. It's not going to pass in a single state this year. But the fact that it has been filed, we have a wave of this for the first time, it reminds me of, now one of the things I'm known for in Maine is I was the bill sponsor for constitutional carry. Back when we got it in before New Hampshire did. So I like to jive my New Hampshire friends on that. But I remember 10 years ago when the challenge was just getting the people to file the bills in the first place. It doesn't, controversial legislation like this doesn't pass the first time out. What has to happen is you got to find the champions who will have the courage to stand up and file a bill and argue for it, and it's going to get voted down. They're going to fight you. They're going to beat it down. But the goal is the first round to get as many of the politicians on record as possible. Get the roll call notes. Get them on record. Get the clear enemies that you can beat up in re-election season, like you've got in Idaho. I've got one in Maine, a state senator who killed the bill in committee, who was actually the state senator for the activist who led the charge for this. A two combat tour, a veteran of the Iraq Wars in Maine, Commander or Sergeant Aaron Rollins, commander of the American Legion Post. You find the politicians who you can make an example out of come re-election season. You show the rest of the politicians that there are penalties. You will be held accountable if you vote against constitutional war, if you vote to continue to give Washington, D.C. a blank check to send our sons and daughters off to fight and die in wars that nobody can even explain the mission for anymore. We have to show that there are consequences. So this takes a couple cycles.
So speaking of that real quick, New Hampshire, listen real quick. Brody DeShays here in your state helped to kill it here because Kevin Craig filed it. Brody DeShays is one of the politicians that we should absolutely go after. And just like Eric's talking about here, he sat in on our meetings, acted like he was a part of it, used our arguments, lied about the arguments to then get it killed in committee. These people are not your friends. These are sociopaths. Remember, right? We're not trying to like engage with these horrible people. We have to root them out, and it has to be brutal and vicious because like these people have to pay and they have to feel it if we're ever going to get it. But he's talking about the beginning of the big fight that's happening. Once you show that there was accountability for one politician in the state, maybe they got a primary challenge, and you're not supposed to primary challenge incumbents. What's wrong with you? Are you crazy? These are the kinds of things here. But once they see that they might get primary challenged if they're against this, and maybe they lose their race, maybe they don't, but they went through an uncomfortable situation. Once you can show that there are consequences, that the grassroots people will make their political lives miserable, the other politicians watch that and say, geez, I don't want that to happen to me. That's how constitutional carry went from being a fringe issue to now being passed in 21 states over the course of a decade. And that's what has to happen to Defend the Guard, if we're going to Defend the Guard from being an issue that is merely sponsored in 31 states to an issue that is passing in 31 states. It's going to take a couple cycles, but what happened this year so far was very encouraging. And I just want to double down on this because to me, I am just like you guys, right? right? It's the only way to get, to put the pressure relief on. And I think that this, especially here, because if we're talking about the biggest issues, right, I think we can all agree, which is the war and the Fed. And if we're going to go after the war part, we have to do it in a way. So not only is it good on radical decentralization, but it takes care of the biggest issue that we should put number one, which is you're killing people and you're sending good people with good hearts to go do horrible things. Right? And these are horrible people. Like Liz Cheney has personally, has said, we're never going to get out of there. She dragged one of my friends down into one of those dingy basements down in D.C. And just like there with another like Pentagon official was like, oh no, we're never going to get out of there. She threatened to take C-130s, the funding and all of this stuff, the resources from one state, move it to another. Swore that she would move the resources to another state if this bill got passed. These people are horrible people. Yeah, this is Wyoming.
That's the people of Wyoming. It's going to say, well, if Wyoming passes this, I will lobby to take the funding out of Wyoming and give it to some state she doesn't represent.
Another state, she'd rather do that. So these are horrible people. Now, all you guys know is she's horrible. Right? So that's not a surprise. No one's really what? Yeah. Let's see. I wanted to talk a little bit about the process and where you guys can help. And huge resources in Eric, the people at Hazard, Ben, Rockstar. He really did have to fight for it. And I'm going to tell you right now, there is a difference in caliber between someone who just files it and does nothing for it, and someone who files it and then begins to fight for it. Because there's a lot of things that have to happen here, right? First, again, like he said, you have to get it filed. So that means you have to find someone with a little bit of cajones, right? So you have to do that first. Then once it gets filed, then you have to start building out things like, hey, where does each legislator in the committee stand on this? So if we did, would it get passed? Then you have to do the grassroots effort to get it heard. Because sometimes they're like, yeah, I would, but I don't know. Like maybe they won't bring it up. But they're hoping that this doesn't come up in committee so that they don't have to vote for it. But then maybe you put grassroots efforts and they do have to vote for it. So maybe then it gets out of committee. Now we're talking about it getting on the floor, right? Then once it gets on the floor, you have to figure out, like he said, who's your enemies? Who do you have to get out of there? Who do you have to make pay? Who's the one that did it? And then now you're talking Senate. And then you have to talk about getting it signed and all of this. And that's where grassroots really comes in, is because it is really effective to have people mobilized. When you actually take human action, you can actually get a lot of stuff done.
I just wanted to add one thing. Yes, getting the bill out there into the public, and I'm going to talk from Idaho's perspective because that's what I know. I've talked to a lot of members on that committee, and I've talked to the speaker. I actually had a very robust discussion, to say the least, with the Speaker of the House of Idaho about how my bill was handled, and the ultimate statement that he made to me was, well, what will it take for you to put it down? Print my damn bill. That's what I want. Again, it didn't happen this year, but think about it like this. The farther the bill goes, the more people talk about it. And this topic of ending these, we'll call them what they are, that seem to be forever wars. This topic is not it's not a debate in this country anymore. It's not a debate in the veteran community. I've said this multiple times. The only people who don't realize that we're done with it are the bureaucrats at the Pentagon. They're the only ones that haven't figured that out yet. So every time this bill gets brought up in a state, the more it gets talked about, the more it gets pushed out into the public. And I'm convinced that's why my bill didn't get a bill number. Because sometimes what they'll do in Idaho is they'll print the bill so you can talk about it with a bill number and people can go read it, but they put it in a drawer and say not this year. Well, they didn't do that. They didn't get a bill number. It didn't get printed. It wasn't accessible to the public. Because they don't want people talking about it. Because they know they're on the losing side of this one.
I want to echo kind of what you're saying here. There has never been, at least in my lifetime, at least since the start of this course, I don't think there has ever been a better time for an issue like this. Because I remember back in the George W. Bush days, the Republican consensus that we need to be over there, we need to fight them over there so we don't fight them over here, that kind of line. That has withered away. The Republican base is more anti-war than I have ever seen today. The Democrats, at least the grassroots, still know kind of in their heart of their hearts that they're supposed to be against these wars, even if they've lost their way for a couple of years. We can build a real coalition around this, especially by the fact that those who are leading the charge aren't a bunch of hippie peaceniks. It's like the folks who fought the wars themselves, the folks coming home saying, there's never been a clear mission. We don't know why we're over there. No one knows why we're over there. The Afghanistan papers came out 2 years ago showing the top military brass doesn't even know what victory would look like. Nobody knows why we're fighting these wars except for maybe the military-industrial complex to pad their pockets. So these wars, and you can look at polling data. Huge majorities of Americans generally think the war should end. But it's an even bigger percentage when it comes to the American veteran community that says that these wars should end. So the fact that we have a built-in base for this of the veteran community, just like an issue like constitutional carry had a built-in base of gun owners. They have that built-in base that you can mobilize, that form the core of the grassroots that are fighting for this, that have authority and authenticity to speak on this issue. And you can build from there. You can start to put the screws to the politicians and show them there are political consequences for voting the wrong way. And eventually, when you show that the people are serious in enforcing those political consequences, you don't need all the right politicians in the right places to do the right things. Sometimes it's just good enough to shape the political environment around the wrong politicians to make it politically expedient for them to do the right thing. So when we pass constitutional carry in Maine, and I'm sure many of the other states have been passed, it's not because every politician who voted for it thought it was a really great idea to give the people their freedoms back. It's because they thought it was a really great idea for them and the re-election because their email inboxes and voicemail inboxes were exploding with constituents demanding it. And that's where we need to get with Defend the Guard, and we're in the early stages of that. And in every state where this has been put forward, we found an entity to make an example out of. And that's step 2.
That's fantastic. Said. And another thing here is, I know that one thing, especially this crowd that's here in person, you guys all get it, right? For the most part. And here's what I'm saying. Just because you're right doesn't mean you're going to win, right? And I say people that love liberty truly, like that is their core principle at their heart. They suffer from similar symptoms, right? It's messaging and mobilization, right? It's cool to do it online. That's great. When you got to show up, knock the door, and make a phone call, those phones are cold. And when it comes to messaging, just because you're right doesn't mean that you're going to convince people. So I'm sure a majority of you probably know the Horton rule, and I would exercise you to use it, right? You don't want
What's
to
the Horton rule for those who might not know the Horton rule?
The Horton rule is that you attack someone from their own identity. You attack the left from the left and the right from the right. And Scott's going to be here, I think, today or tomorrow, so we can even ask him if he's better at it than me. Obviously, it's his rule, right? Or Michael Bolton made it, but by the way, he's the king at it. So it's just come to the left from the left, right? Don't try to take away their identity when you're trying to come to a certain understanding. So please understand that, right? Because if you beat them over the head with the things that you and I would all be nodding our head and shaking, yeah, of course, 100%, it's horrible, right? That's cool, but that's never going to work with them. So try to understand that if you really want to win and not just be right, you have to come to it from a perspective that's going to change their mind. Because at the end of the day, that's what we want to do, right? We're going to stop sending people to their death. We want to stop mass murder, right? And I think that counts and that matters more than being right. Right? So don't be obnoxious about it. I'm not saying anybody here would, but sometimes just because we're right, we think that, oh, well, here we go. No. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one quick thing, specifically regarding, you brought up Liz Cheney, and that's a trigger word for me. When Liz Cheney was removed from leadership, I commented that it was a good thing, and that the Republican Party was better for it. And I got a lot of hate from a lot of people who hate Trump. And I never mentioned Trump, because to me, it's not about Trump. God forbid a post 9/11 veteran wants to see leadership without a chain in it, right? My unit that I served in the Marine Corps was 3rd Battalion 8th Marines, and the motto is "Fortune favors the bold." And I believe that. I've seen it work. And on this issue, it works. In the Republican Party, at the base, the Liz Cheney, Dick Cheney Republican Party is dead. It's dead. We have to be willing to seize that opportunity and seize the moment boldly. That's why think about this, 31 states. This organization's been here for 2 years, 31 states. The momentum is building. I encourage you guys to get out there and do the same.
And I'll add one thing. Are we getting to the end of the time?
We have 20 minutes, I think.
Oh, okay. Do we want to take questions?
Yeah, I figured like right around now, it's probably good time to
Okay.
take questions.
Well, I'll say one final thing, and maybe we'll open for questions. So, Defend the Guard is a radical bill. It is radical nullification of Washington, D.C. power over the most important thing. Was it Murray Rothbard who said war is the health of the state? If we can undermine that ability for Washington, D.C., the politicians to allow our nation to go to war without any ability for the people to hold it accountable, so they won't even vote on the damn wars, then that's a very good thing. And we've seen nullification work over the last 20 years. Nullification worked on ending the war on cannabis. I mean, officially it's still illegal on the federal level. But 44 states now have nullified that. Said, we don't recognize your authority. We're just going to ignore federal law and we're going to craft our own policies. States that even faster with things like right to try, nullifying the FDA, allowing terminally ill patients to try investigational medicines without if you've got 6 months to live, why should you wait 10 years for the FDA approval process? This is crazy. So we've done nullification on these important issues, but there's no more important issue than the wars. It is the linchpin. It is the keystone of everything. The empire will do everything they can to defend the forever wars. But this is the weak spot. They've been able to stop us from making any progress in Congress in Washington, D.C. for 2 decades now. We have failed in Washington, D.C. We have failed in Congress because that is a system designed for us to fail. Their weak spot is the states. If we can bring the National Guard home, if we can bring 50% of the active duty troops home with this legislation, they will not be able to continue these wars in the ways that they have. Or they will, at very least, Congress will have to go on record and formally vote to authorize them, and then we can hold the federal politicians accountable again for issues of war and peace.
Fantastic. So we have 15 minutes left. And I'll also add that we're going to do like an extra, where we're going to go back to the Mises tent. We're going to set it up there, and we'll be able to take more questions. So if you just want to talk about it, if you're hearing this, you're like, oh my God, I've never heard this before. I just want to talk about it. We're here to answer questions. We'll talk about it and everything. I'll show you everything you need to do or whatever. But yeah, if you want to open up for questions, all right.
The other 31.
Can't hear you.
Sorry. The other 31 bills that have been introduced, do those all have the Title 32, Title 10 distinction, or you added that to that one?
His bill is the one that we use as model legislation. So the Idaho bill is the one that we send out. And so like if I talk to a legislator, and he's like, hey, I want to put this forward, and we send them that. And not only that, they also have like legislative people that push back and say, correct this and this and this to tailor to the states and all that stuff. So they do have help, and we do send that model legislation out. So yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to say one quick anyone is in Wolfboro or knows anyone in Wolfboro who will run against Brody and Shades, come find me at the East of Scottish Town. I want him out.
Yes.
We're not going to pass this bill the first time, but he sabotaged it, and I want him out of the legislature.
Yeah.
And I'll say, if anyone knows anyone in Somerset County, Maine, we're looking for a primary challenger against the state senator there who did the same thing in Maine. So,
Just don't bring it up here.
I think this is great, brilliant. I wholeheartedly support the sentiment, but I have one nagging question about mine.
Can you just talk a little louder with the flute to it? Yeah, we're recording.
I have a question about the potential unintended consequences of winning.
Okay.
When the U.S. Army stopped drafting people and sending them to Vietnam, the anti-war movement died. If we stop sending National Guardsmen off to die, what is that going to do to the actual?
I'll take it. I care more about them living than the movement going away. If there's no more wars, like, yeah, we won. I'm good. Yeah, I'll take it.
yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. Obviously, the end of the draft, even though we still formally officially have the draft, but that was one of the great kind of libertarian accomplishments. I remember was it Milton Friedman kind of in a debate with some military general and said, well, I don't want to lead an army of mercenaries, and Milton Friedman said, better an army of mercenaries than an army of slaves. And that was one of the final nails in the coffin of the draft. Daughter being randomly selected to go fight and die in a foreign country, that certainly took some of the skin out of the game for the American people on the wars. And the intensity on this issue just isn't what it was in the Vietnam era. That's certainly true. What I would say here is we're talking about taking away 50% of the active duty, combat troops overseas, which would seriously, and here's the simple thing. Congress can easily get around this. It will seriously hamper their ability to fight these undeclared wars. Congress can easily get around it. All they have to do is one thing. They got to declare war. They got to go on record so we can hold us accountable. So I'm not certain that this would disarm the intensity of the anti-war movement to the same degree as the removing the draft did. Though I certainly hear the point. I think it's simply going to force the hand of those in Congress because they want to continue fighting the wars, but they don't want to sign their name on it. They're going to have to pick one of the guys.
Yeah. Can I do want to appreciate that too? Unintended consequences, right? Well, one of the unintended consequences of 20 years of undeclared war is having a massive demographic of trained warriors that know what it is. There's no veil. When you're 18, you're 17, 18 years old, and that recruiter's talking to you, he's pitching something very different than what you see later on. So the unintended consequences, and I've considered this myself because I was active duty. I wasn't in the Guard. So this legislation wouldn't affect the Marine Corps. It wouldn't. It wouldn't affect the active duty Army. It wouldn't affect active duty Air Force, Navy. The way the law sits right now, the executive still has all that authority. So one of the arguments that's been challenged to me from National Guard generals, the brass, that oppose my bill is, well, the federal government will just take those National Guard units and turn them into active duty units. And then they won't be yours anymore. And the state will, the feds will be able to use them however they want. Good luck doing that to 50 states. You do that to one state, and this is something that a lot of people haven't quite pieced together because it's a new concept. if this bill gets passed, and let's say the Pentagon says we're going to be punitive to that state. Let's say the state is Idaho. The feds say we're going to be punitive, we're going to pull their Harriers, we're going to pull these aircraft, we're going to pull this unit into active duty, and we're going to pay them less. Well, for that to happen, it has to go through Congress, and I don't know any representative or congressman or senator who is going to be rah-rahing their state National Guard getting a decrease in anything. I don't know any state that wants to get reelected. Let's just say it that way. Unless they're Liz Cheney.
These letters of marque reprisal to be a way that they could sneak in, switching, dropping support for the Guard, and we had, we'll call it actually the jobs program and say we're hiring Made in America, USA only mercenaries because the Guard won't support us.
I would just say there, I mean, at least with letters of marque and reprisal, that's still something that has to be voted on. I mean, the big breakdown as I see it, and the reason the wars have gone on for so long is because they have found a way to get away with starting new wars without voting. So, look, Congress vote for letters of marque and reprisal that take our troops to war, or have mercenaries sent to take someone out of Canada or wherever.
And have to put their name on it.
The big thing is, once they sign their names to it, we can go to their constituents and say, can you believe your congressman did this? And they don't want to do it, they're afraid of doing that because they saw after they signed their names to the Iraq War that people lost their re-elections over it. And so they tried to short circuit the system so they don't have to ever do that again. So our challenge is, how do we get them to sign their names to these things again so that we can connect what happens, we can connect these wars to the people in power that we can vote out of office, and that's how you can control the political system is you gotta, this is what the Constitution gives us, the ability to throw the bums out, but you can't do that if you don't have the roll call votes to go to the people and say, this is what they're doing in your name. Can you believe this? You gotta get rid of this guy.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Questions?
Also, Ben, to add on to the threat that the federal government will turn the National Guard into active duty, contracts between National Guard and active duty are totally different. Shouldn't do that. Those new deals to take that manpower and transfer it. Wouldn't happen.
It would take a lot more funding as well. And something, I just want to say one more thing about unintended consequences. There are always unintended consequences, but I, for one, don't see the unintended consequences of reining in our federal government, our wars, making our Congress accountable. I don't see a downside in terms of if you're talking about unintended consequences of 20 years of undeclared war, or consequences of reining in your Congress and reining in the war powers. That's a good trade-off to me. I think that's a good trade-off for probably all of you.
Cool. So I think, unless you have something else, I just wanted, before we do, you can get a lot of this information. All of this information is on bringourtroopshome.us or defendtheguard.us. You can literally go click on your state, right, to see if any legislator has put the bill forward in your state, and if you can find one, you can email it to us, you can call me. I literally keep my phone on until I work myself out of all these wars. So I will take calls and emails 24/7 from you. So go to Bring It Troops Home or defendtheguard.us. Also, the 10/7 Club, which is the anniversary of these horrible wars in Afghanistan, is what helps to fund, essentially our grassroots team that does this. So if you want, over at the Mises tent, if you subscribe to anywhere from $1 a month for the 10/7 Club, which helps defend the Guard, we'll give you a square and a patch, and we do raffles for ARs and everything like that. So if you want to come talk to me at the tent, and we can do that too. That also helps us a lot because we have to be able to do this and fund it too. Go ahead, Frank.
I don't know if you agree. I think one thing I will add, the veteran community in America has turned against these wars. So you have the American Legion, which is the largest veterans lobbying organization in the country. The official position of the American Legion, based on a national resolution that was passed in recent years, is to end the forever wars. That is an official position of the American Legion. And you have smaller, American legions, local American legions passing, resolutions specifically in support of defend the Guard. And this is just like, I've said this before, I'll say it again because I think it bears repeating. Just like the gun owning community was a great base to build support for constitutional carry and built from that 10 years ago, the veterans community is at a point where we can build a base out of there for defend the Guard and mobilize folks and hold politicians accountable.
And let me give you a little bit of that insight, Ben, just check me if I'm wrong, but I promise. So you get there and you realize, one, the first thing you start to realize when, you pull the veil is that it's not about country, it's not about the nation, it's not about bringing democracy, it's about getting your buddy home. Am I wrong? No. That's the thing. And you realize it's nonsense from the early moments of which you get there and you say, oh, okay, this is all just nonsense. So a lot of veterans, please, I would go to them too, because a lot of them understand how it really is. Unless they swallow the ultimate blue pill, in that case, sorry. But for the most part, a lot of these guys are your friends. I promise.
I'm going to put a terrible plug for myself. If you want to know anything about myself or my campaign or what I stand for, what I run for, my website is benadamsforidaho.com. If you guys want to check it out.
Nice.
I'll say a final note from me. If you'd like to learn more about Young Americans for Liberty and what we're doing to mobilize our thousands of grassroots activists across the country to go out, knock doors, get great Liberty champions elected to state legislatures. When I was in the state Senate, we had maybe like 10 Ron Paul-style Liberty legislators across the country, and we weren't networked in any way. Today, we have over 170 in 37 states because of this strategy of taking Liberty activists and making them Liberty legislators. And interesting things are happening because of that. And we're also now going into the legislatures themselves and using our activists to take the screws to the politicians during legislative season. And through that, we've been passing constitutional carry, school choice, a whole host of great liberty policies across the country this year. But you can learn more about Young Americans for Liberty at yaliberty.org. And you can also follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Senator Brakey. And I'll just end furthermore, my opinion is the Federal Reserve should be destroyed. Thank you.
All right, guys, we will